"Someone has to stay home and keep things running," my sister-in-law said, adjusting the strap of her overnight bag with a smile so practiced it almost looked real. "You understand, don't you?" My husband stood beside her in the driveway, loading the last suitcase into the back of the SUV, the same SUV I had rented, the same trip I had planned down to the last reservation. He didn't look at me. He hadn't looked at me properly in months. I stood in the doorway of the house we shared, wearing the flannel shirt I'd picked out specifically for the first morning at the lake, and I watched them drive away. The family cabin in Vermont had been in my husband's family for 32 years. His father had built it with his own hands, spending every weekend for 2 summers laying the foundation, hauling timber, learning as he went. My father-in-law had told me that story on the first Thanksgiving I spent with the family, leaning close like it was a secret, his eyes bright with the kind of pride that comes not from wealth but from work. "I built it for the people I love," he'd said, squeezing my hand. "That includes you now." He passed away 14 months ago, 3 weeks before he died. While my husband was out getting coffee and my sister-in-law was parking the car, my father-in-law had pressed something into my hand, a small brass key, old and worn smooth at the edges. "The lockbox in the cabin," he whispered, his voice thin but steady. "Don't open it until you need to. You'll know when." I had carried that key in the zippered pocket of my wallet ever since. What my husband and his sister didn't know, what I had been quietly, carefully making sure they didn't know for the past 4 months, was that I had been back to that cabin, twice. And what I found in that lockbox had changed everything I thought I understood about the last decade of my life, and about what was being planned behind my back. I waited until their car turned the corner at the end of the street. Then I went inside, made myself a cup of coffee, sat down at the kitchen table, and opened my laptop. I had work to do. The kind of work they had assumed I'd never be capable of. It started the way these things always do, with something small. 7 months ago, I noticed that the monthly statement from our joint savings account didn't match the transfer history I kept in a separate spreadsheet, a habit my father-in-law had recommended years ago with a wink. "Always keep your own numbers, sweetheart. Not because you don't trust anyone, just because it's wise." At first, I told myself it was a bank error. Then I told myself my husband must have moved funds for a reason he'd forgotten to mention. Then I found the second account. It was registered in my husband's name alone, opened 11 months ago, 1 month before his father's diagnosis was confirmed. I found the statements tucked inside a manila folder labeled car insurance in the back of his desk drawer. Over $40,000 had moved from our joint account into that private one, in increments small enough not to trigger an alert. I sat with that folder for a long time. Then I closed the drawer exactly as I had found it and went to make dinner like nothing had happened. That was when I began to truly pay attention. My sister-in-law had moved back to town 8 months ago, after years living across the country. She'd told the family it was because she missed everyone, because she wanted to be closer after losing her father. What I noticed, what I wrote down in a notebook I kept locked in my car, was that within 6 weeks of her arrival, my husband started taking lunch meetings he didn't explain, coming home later than usual, lowering his voice when he spoke on the phone in the next room. I was not invited to be in the same room when my sister-in-law visited. She always had a reason. She and my husband needed to go through Dad's paperwork. They needed to sort some family financial things. Things that, apparently, a wife of 9 years had no business knowing about. The cabin trip had been my idea, my planning, my deposits. I'd booked it 3 months in advance as a way to bring everyone back together after the grief of the past year. I made the reservation for 4, my husband, his sister, my husband's college friend and his wife, and myself. I chose the weekends. I paid the security deposit. 2 days before we were supposed to leave, my sister-in-law called to let me know there wasn't really room for me. She said it gently, almost tenderly. "We need some time to process things as a family. You understand." My husband backed her up that evening, not quite meeting my eyes. What neither of them knew was that the night before they left, while my husband slept, I had gone out to the car and slipped a sealed envelope into the front pocket of the hiking pack he always brought to the cabin, the one he'd had since college, olive green and worn at the buckles. Inside that envelope was a letter. The letter was not angry. It was not threatening. It was a single page, printed cleanly, and it explained, in precise and thoroughly documented terms, exactly what I had found over the past 4 months and what was waiting for them if they continued. I had also written, at the bottom of the page, check the lockbox, because I had been back to the cabin. I had found what my father-in-law had left, and I had added to it. The call came on the second day. I was sitting on the back porch with a cup of tea when my phone rang. I let it ring twice before I answered. My husband's voice was different than I had ever heard it. Not angry, not smooth, not carefully reasonable. It was the voice of someone who has reached into their pocket and found something completely unexpected, something cold. "What is this?" he said. Not a question, more like a man reading the ground in front of him, trying to figure out whether it would hold his weight. "Which part are you asking about?" I said. My voice was steady. I had practiced being steady. "How long have you known?" "Long enough. Long enough to be very thorough." There was a long pause. I could hear my sister-in-law's voice in the background, sharp and low. My husband covered the phone, but not well. "She knows about the account," he said to her. And then, muffled, "She knows about all of it." I waited. He came back. "Camille." "It's Rachel," I said, just to hear him stumble. He caught himself. "Rachel, this isn't what it looks like. You moved $42,000 out of our joint savings into an account I was never told about. Your sister has been present for every meeting with your father's estate attorney. Meetings, I was told, were canceled. You signed a document last month authorizing the transfer of the cabin deed, the property your father built and left to both of you jointly into your sister's name alone. And the reason you needed me to stay home this weekend was because the notary was scheduled to come to the cabin to finalize the transfer." I paused. "Tell me what part I'm misreading." The silence was different this time, heavier. Then my sister-in-law's voice came on the phone. She'd taken it from him. She sounded like a woman recalibrating in real time, reaching for the version of herself that had always been able to manage me. "You're upset," she said, "and you have every right to be. We should have communicated better. But you have to understand that the cabin is a family matter, a blood family matter, and my brother and I just felt—" "I found the lockbox," I said. The recalibration stopped. "Your father showed me where it was," I continued. "He gave me the key 3 weeks before he died. I opened it 4 months ago." I heard her sharp intake of breath. I heard my husband say something urgent in the background. "I've made copies of everything inside," I said. "Multiple copies. They're in several different locations, with several different people. One of them is your father's attorney, not the one you've been using for the estate. The other one, the one your father retained separately, 18 months ago, specifically because he didn't trust the process." My sister-in-law's voice, when it came, had lost its warmth entirely. "How did you know about him?" "Because your father told me. The same afternoon he gave me the key. He said, 'If anything seems wrong, call Thomas.' He wrote the number on the back of a recipe card." I almost smiled. My father-in-law, that careful, practical, quietly loving man. "He liked me," I added. "He trusted me. He said I was the one who paid attention." What I didn't say, what I would save for later, was what Thomas had told me when I called him 2 months ago. What he had shown me when I drove to his office and sat across from him at a table covered in manila folders. What had made me sit very still for a long time before I drove home and began, in earnest, to prepare. My husband came back on the phone. His voice had changed again, flatter, more careful. "Rachel, whatever you think you have, you should open the lockbox," I said. "The one in the cabin. There are some additional documents I left there on my last visit. I think you'll want to read them before you make any more decisions about what to do next." I ended the call. I put my phone face down on the porch railing. I sat there for a while, watching the backyard, the oak tree my father-in-law had helped us plant the spring after we bought this house. He'd brought it in the back of his truck, roots wrapped in burlap, grinning like a child. I let myself cry then, just for a few minutes, because I still loved the man he had been, because 9 years of marriage is 9 years, because grief for what a thing was is not the same as wanting to go back to it. Then I wiped my face, picked up my phone, and called my older sister. "It started," I said. "I know," she said. "I saw him call. Are you okay?" "I'm okay. Is everything ready on your end?" "Everything's ready." My sister had been my quiet partner in this for 2 months. It was she who had helped me make sense of the documents Thomas had shown me. She who had sat with me while I read, For the first time, the full scope of what my husband and his sister had been building in the year since their father died. Thomas, it turned out, had been my father-in-law's attorney for 23 years, a quiet, methodical man in his 60s, with reading glasses on a chain and a habit of pausing before he spoke. He had called me, he said, because he had been waiting for me to call him first, waiting to see if I would find the key, find the lockbox, find the number, waiting, as he put it, to see if my father-in-law's faith in me was warranted. It was. The lockbox had contained 3 things. The first was a copy of my father-in-law's updated will, the real one, the one drafted 6 weeks before his death, not the earlier version my husband and his sister had been working from. The second was a series of bank records with certain transactions highlighted in yellow, marker his own handwriting, his own annotations, his own growing suspicion documented in the margins. The third was a letter, sealed, addressed to me. I had read that letter so many times I could recite it from memory. Rachel, if you're reading this, then my instincts were right, and I'm sorry for what you're going through. I want you to know that what I'm about to leave you is not a burden. It is what you've earned, through 9 years of caring for my son even when he didn't deserve it, through every holiday you kept together, through every kindness you showed me when I was stubborn and difficult and sometimes very wrong. The cabin is yours, the full deed, not a share mine to give, and I've made sure it's been properly prepared. Thomas has the documents. You'll know what to do with them. You always know what to do. Don't let them tell you otherwise. With all my love and gratitude, your father-in-law, Robert. My husband did not know his father had changed the will. My sister-in-law did not know her father had noticed what she was doing. And neither of them had any idea that Thomas, on my father-in-law's standing instructions, had already filed a formal complaint with the state bar regarding the other attorney, the one they'd been using, citing concerns about undue influence and document fraud. That process had been quietly moving forward for 2 months. By the time they opened the lockbox at the cabin and found the documents, I had added copies of the new will, the filed complaint, Thomas's contact information, and a single handwritten note from me that read, "I gave you every chance to be honest. Call me when you're ready to talk." Several things had already been set in motion. The estate attorney they'd been using had been notified that his conduct was under review. The title company that had been processing the fraudulent cabin transfer had received a certified letter from Thomas's office, halting the transaction pending investigation. And the $42,000 that had been moved from our joint account, that one I had handled myself, quietly, legally, with the help of a family law attorney my sister had recommended. The money was in a protected account, documented as marital assets, pending the proceedings I had hoped I wouldn't need to file but had prepared for nonetheless. My husband called again that evening. He'd had several hours to think. His voice was different now, quieter, the careful reasonableness stripped away. He sounded, for the first time in a long time, like himself. Like the man I'd married. That almost made it worse. "I didn't mean for it to go this far," he said. "I know," I said. "I believe you. But it did. My sister, she was so angry after Dad died, about the way he'd set things up. She thought it was unfair. She thought the fact that your father trusted me was unfair," I said. "Yes, I know. I also know you let her convince you that I didn't deserve what he left me, that I'd only be in the way of the family deciding its own affairs." I paused. "I need you to understand something. This isn't about the cabin, or the money. I could have lived without both of those things. Then what is it about? You didn't fight for me," I said. "Not once. Every time she pushed, you stepped back. Every time she suggested I wasn't really family, you stayed quiet. 9 years, and I was never worth an argument." He didn't answer for a long time. "Thomas is going to be in touch," I said. "There are things that need to be sorted out properly, through the right channels. I'd suggest you cooperate fully. Your father would want you to do the right thing, even now." "What about us?" he asked. I had thought about this question for 4 months. I had turned it over in every quiet room, on every early morning walk, in every moment when I was holding the key in my hand and wondering what my father-in-law had seen in me that his own son had stopped seeing. "I don't know yet," I said. "But I know that right now, I need you to let me do what needs to be done." What needed to be done took the better part of 3 months. The bar complaint against the estate attorney resulted in a formal investigation. He had, it emerged, prepared documents at my sister-in-law's direction, without informing my husband of their full implications, and without ever informing me that I existed as a party with legal standing in the estate. His license was suspended pending the outcome. My sister-in-law, faced with the actual legal reality of what she had orchestrated, went through several phases: fury first, then denial, then a long and difficult silence. Thomas met with her twice. I was not present at those meetings. I had decided, carefully, that my goal was not to destroy her but to correct the record and protect what was rightfully mine. She did not go to jail, but she did sign documents acknowledging the validity of the updated will, restoring the cabin deed to its proper status, and repaying to the estate the funds she had redirected through the complicit attorney's channels. My husband and I separated. It was not a clean separation. 9 years of marriage is not a clean anything, but it was, in the end, an honest one. He was not a cruel man. He was a weak one. Sometimes that is harder to forgive. On a Tuesday morning in October, exactly 11 months after my father-in-law had pressed a small brass key into my palm, I drove up to the cabin in Vermont alone. The fall had turned the trees every shade of orange and gold, the lake flat and silver in the early light. I sat on the porch for a long time with a cup of coffee, the same porch where my father-in-law used to sit in the mornings when the family visited, watching the water, perfectly at peace. I thought about the afternoon he'd told me about building this place, how he'd said, with his quiet certainty, "I built it for the people I love." I had thought, then, that he meant his family by blood. I understood now what he had actually meant. He meant the people who showed up, the people who paid attention, the people who stayed. My phone buzzed a message from my sister. "How is it?" I looked out at the water, at the dock he'd built with the same hands that had built the walls around me. "Exactly right," I wrote back. I stayed at the cabin for 4 days. I cooked for myself for the first time in months without thinking about whether someone else would like it. I read books I'd been meaning to read for years. I sat on the dock in the afternoons with my feet over the water and let myself think about what came next, not with dread but with something that felt, cautiously, like possibility. On the last morning, I went back to the lockbox. It was empty now, everything properly filed, properly resolved, properly in its place. I left only one thing inside, a photograph I'd brought with me, my father-in-law and I at the house, the October before he got sick, standing next to the oak tree he'd helped us plant. He was grinning. I was grinning. We both looked very much like people who knew something good was happening. I locked the box. I put the key back in my pocket. A year later, I hosted Thanksgiving at the cabin for the first time. Thomas came, and his wife, my sister and her husband, 2 neighbors from my father-in-law's old street who had stayed in touch, who had stories about him I'd never heard, a colleague of mine who had no family nearby and had mentioned it once, almost in passing, the kind of detail my father-in-law would have caught and acted on. I cooked the things my father-in-law had loved. I used his cast-iron pan and his grandmother's recipe for cornbread that he'd written out for me in his careful, slightly sideways handwriting. I set his old chair at the head of the table, empty, because I wasn't ready to stop leaving that space for him. During dinner, Thomas raised a glass. He said my father-in-law had told him once, near the end, that a person's true character shows itself not in their success, but in what they do when they realize they've been betrayed. Whether they become bitter or whether they become better. I thought about the woman who had stood in the doorway of her house in a flannel shirt and watched her husband drive away. How small she had felt. How she had stood there a moment too long, until the car was out of sight and the street was quiet, before she went inside and sat down and began, very quietly, to take care of things. They had left me behind to look after everything. I had done exactly that, just not in the way they expected.